Hi, everyone. I think we're ready to start. Thank you for your patience while we sorted out some technical things. Well, it's very exciting to welcome you all here tonight, and very nice to see so many people around the table. If anyone would like to join us around the table, please come closer. You have better access to food and drink. So this is the second in the New Standards lecture series, and the series aims to identify and confront some of the barriers to architecture, its education and practice, and consider how these can be overcome to embrace wider forms of creativity. Each event in the series will address the idea of comfort in all its nuanced forms and challenge the idea of standards as a bare minimum, a one-size-fits-all approach. And together we will question how we might better provide this through both the way we design spaces, but also how we teach architecture. So we're really sorry that for health reasons, speakers Raquel Masegua and Jordan Whitewood-Neal are unable to join us this evening. I'm sure you join us in sending them our very best and wishing them I guess, to feel better soon. We'd like to give a special mention to Jordan in particular for being a true driving force behind not just this event, but the series as a whole, and for really shaping so much of the conversations that have led to us being able to do this at the AA this term. As well as the conversations with Jordan, this series really evolved out of a series of workshops that I attended that were organized by Joss Boyce, who was running a project called the Disordinary Project that was pairing up disabled artists with architecture schools. And I was very fortunate to be part of the AA's contribution to that. And I got to work with deaf artist Aaron Williamson, who was part of last week's session with my students who till today talk about how much they gained from that experience and learning from Aaron's incredible practice. And it was through that together with Barbara Penner from the Bartlett, we did a cross-institutional workshop to really question, look, where space standards come from. And we were thinking about how so much of space standards are generated from white militarized male bodies who don't actually reflect, I guess, the lived experience of most people. And so if that's inscribed in all our spaces, how can we ever hope to feel comfortable within them and for them to really be inclusive? So one of the main drivers behind this series is to examine how we can actually move beyond words and actually turn some of these conversations into action. And it felt like these urgent and very overdue conversations could act as a test bed for future AA events. And we're hopefully going to try and think about what does that mean to reconsider what we think of as the norm. So we're trying to really think about how this series will continue next term with a charrette where students, staff, and hopefully all of you gathered around here today will participate in kind of rethinking parts of the AA through built interventions, through designing new forms of policy, to really think about how this can be a more comfortable space for everyone. And the charrette will be documented and put forward to the AA as suggestions that could catalyze long-term and meaningful changes to make the school more inclusive. So after that very long speech, I should say I'm Manisha Verghese. My pronouns are she, her, and today I'm wearing a very graphic black and white top. And I'm now going to hand over.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So I'm Harriet Jennings. My pronouns are she, her. I have dark brown hair, a blonde streak, and I'm wearing a big pink shirt. And together with Manajay, I've been working on planning this series at the AA for some months with the intention of widening conversations on what make inclusive space. And tonight we're really delighted to have Pip Jackson and Chris Scarffe join us. So to briefly introduce them, Pip Jackson joined University College London in April 2019 as their inaugural head of inclusive environments, working across the university to provide in-house expertise on inclusive design and access and embedding inclusive environments in their education programme. And Pip sits on a number of industry-led committees and panels and has over 20 years experience of working on access and inclusion in the public sector. And Chris Scarffe is a London-based designer currently working at Universal Design Studio. He recently graduated from the MA Architecture course at the Royal College of Art, where both his thesis and dissertation explored the complex, often contradictory ways that spatial design and the built environment play a role in empowering or indeed disabling differently abled minds and bodies. His dissertation was nominated for the Rebert President's Medal, and he now continues to present his work to architectural practices in London. And in tonight's conversation, they will consider movement and our different experiences of how we pass through spaces, how much time we get to spend in them, and how we define or can defy the expectations of movement in places, from places of domesticity to education and to practice. So Pip will share her work on inclusive design and co-design across UCL, the City of London, the GLA, Camden Council, as well as experience of working with Andrew Walker, who was the founder of the Environmental Access course at the AA in the 1990s. And Chris will present his work examining how spatial design and the built environment play a role in empowering or disabling differently able minds and bodies. And so after their presentations, we're going to open up the conversation that will take place around this communal table. And we hope to facilitate an informal and comfortable discussion between us all. So please do gather around if you're not already. There's still a few spaces that I can see. Feel free to help yourself to food and drink throughout the evening. And if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll come around with the microphone and everyone can chip in. Just before I hand over to the speakers, we want to make everyone aware that every event in this series, including tonight, will have British Sign Language interpretation. So a big thank you to Bernadette and Michelle, who are sitting opposite me here. And if you need to have a clear line of vision towards them, please make sure that you're sitting in the right place and feel free to ask anyone to swap seats. Also, just to let you know that there is an accessible toilet through that door in the far corner. And if you follow the signs, you'll be able to find it. And there's also a quiet room if anyone needs it, which is also just opposite me across the room. Yes, the room, we've got all the windows open in the hope of kind of dispersing any COVID issues. And we'd encourage people to wear face masks when you're able to do so throughout the evening. We do have a box of face masks on the table over there if anyone needs them. And if you need anything during the event, just please come and ask me or Manashe, and we're happy to help you. So I will now hand over to Chris. I believe you're speaking first. Wonderful. I'll hand over to Chris, and I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming him.
So thank you for the introduction and for everyone to come. So I'm just going to start this talk before I kind of get into it. I think when I first started sort of researching this topic, which began out of a personal interest of mine, I kind of was watching Joss Boy's talk, probably in a similar space to this, I think. And I kind of came to it looking for an answer, essentially. I knew that we were kind of, the design experience I'd had before, we weren't doing it quite right in regard to disability and impairment. And I think I'd kind of come to this fear, and I was reading the books, just like trying to find the solution, I guess, trying to find the different way of doing it. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is in this talk or in this presentation, I don't think it's going to be a kind of series of checkpoints that, you can kind of just take and print out as a cheat sheet and say, okay, cool, this is how I do it differently. It's really about trying to encourage a different attitude, I think. The title of this presentation is Rethinking Retrofit, Reimagining the Built Environment to Affirm a Positive Identity for Disability and Impairment. So why retrofit? I think it's really kind of important to pick up on the topic that, we're talking about retrofit a lot more now. The AJ has its retrofit first campaign, and I think it's just really important now more than ever to really start to interrogate, I think, from a disability and impairment point of view, how we're approaching the way we're retrofitting these buildings. Just to talk, I won't go into too much detail on the depths of what governs retrofit and accessibility in the built environment. But one thing that I think is really interesting to pick up on in the Equality Act, which is one of the pieces that essentially govern this sphere, and there's the term reasonable adjustments should be made where necessary to ensure that accessibility and inclusivity is considered and maintained. So I think the reasonable adjustments phrase is really interesting, because what is reasonable and who's asking that question, I think, is a really important topic to interrogate a bit further. I think we've all seen projects where it's deemed reasonable to exclude this access for financial viability reasons and also historical preservation reasons. And I think what's really important to talk about here is that essentially what we're arguing here is that the financial viability of the building or the historical preservation of a building is actually more important than the access and inclusivity of people. So I think also just to talk about definitions, I think definitions is a really interesting place to start. I think one definition here you can see, so disability and impairment. On the left, we see disability defined as being a lack of adequate power, strength, or physical, mental ability or incapacity. Impairment being the state of being diminished, weakened, or damaged, especially mentally or physically. I think what's really important here to talk about definitions, and I think sometimes obviously we can see that the loaded kind of negative language here is pretty awful, but it's about trying to understand how this translates into attitudes, especially architects and designers, which I'll kind of get onto. It's also important here to talk a little bit about the distinction between disability and impairment being two things. Disability is a kind of state or it's a circumstance. It can be temporary, it can be permanent. Whereas impairment is something that, that is a reality. And not everybody likes being sort of declared as being impaired. I think that's important to discuss. But I personally do. And I think it's one of the, as part of the affirmation model, which I'll kind of get onto, in it, I think trying to start to confront the reality of that and also say that impairment isn't necessarily just a completely negative state. Yes, there are challenges about being physically or neurologically or sensory, but actually, that doesn't have to define who you are and your life. So Dr. Colin Cameron redefined both of these terms, and I think you can start to see the kind of positive change here. So disability can be defined as the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in community life on an equal level with others due to physical and social barriers. And impairment is defined as physical, sensory, and intellectual difference to be expected and respected on its own terms in a diverse society. So again, I think what's really interesting is starting to talk about the idea that this is just a reality. It's not about a kind of them and us attitude. It's just actually impairment is a reality in the kind of human population, and starting to understand that, us as a whole rather than a kind of them and us. So the models are something that I think I first started to understand quite early on. And I think it's really important. It's kind of a theoretical framework that we use to kind of frame our perspectives of disability. Again, I think, how we see and how we perceive disability really impacts your approach as designers. And I think this is a really important point I'll kind of come to. But there's kind of broadly three different theoretical models that kind of frame our perspectives. There are many more, but I think the predominant ones are the medical and social, and the affirmative is kind of a more recent emerging model that I personally subscribe to. So the medical model, which is kind of illustrated here by the artist Crippen cartoons, and it essentially really focuses on the problem with the individual. You can see the image here is a kind of man in a wheelchair, and the labels are attached to him. And it really focuses on the things that they can't do rather than what they can do, for example. And I think in this case, it really becomes, the burden becomes with the individual. It's quite a heavy burden to bear. And I think it really starts to make you feel ashamed. And that burden is something you carry quite heavily. So then this was quite a liberating change, I think, in the kind of disability movement, where there was the emergence of the social model, which essentially tried to push the barriers, or the focus was no longer on the labels that we apply to the individual, the things they cannot do, and the problem's not with the individual, the problem's actually with the barriers in society. So we focus on things like the attitudinal barriers, the institutional and organizational barriers, the physical things and immaterial things that we can kind of remove, and the things that are restricting people. And this kind of development, I think, was really liberating for many disabled people. I think it really took the burden off the shoulders of disabled people, and I think allowed us to kind of collectivize and say, and fight and argue for change. And then the affirmative model is this kind of idea that it kind of came out from a criticism of the social model, that even in an ideal world where all of the barriers are removed, the kind of more cultural idea of being disabled is still always going to be seen as a negative state, as a tragic state. And I think the affirmative models, what it's trying to really do is say that, yes, okay, we need to kind of confront that and take it as a cultural model and learn from many of the other kind of the civil rights movements, such as race, sexuality, and gender, by coming together to actively work towards changing the narrative. And I think this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, in that the struggles of many impairments are real, but that's not the thing that has to define you. So how can the model you subscribe to impact the way you design for difference? Well, the medical model, as I've sort of touched on, really focuses on the problem with the individual. So Brian Galt here is a great example where when he was younger, that's images of him when he was younger, and he has these kind of prosthetics strapped on. He was born without any arms. And they really tried to encourage him to wear these prosthetics and making him in the image of the normative able body, essentially. Whereas actually, as he grew up, and he found that he could actually do things with his feet. So you can kind of see the image on the right where he's holding a cup of tea with his big toe. Kind of funny thought is that Brian recently received an MBE. So I don't know if he did, but I like the idea that maybe he shook the Queen's hand with his foot. But also I think in terms of design, we can start to talk about the way it impacts this kind of medicalized aesthetic. Things are designed kind of devoid of creative expression and not thinking about the more experiential aspect of this topic. And it actually just really focuses on fixing the issue from a functional point of view. And then we kind of have the social model and the medical model kind of blending into two here, where we see that the reality of it here is, yes, okay, we're removing barriers, but it's not really thinking about that kind of more cultural and experiential aspect of how does this impact an individual when you're going up a really ephemeral, why are you kind of going up a really ephemeral steel ramp? Or the image in the bottom right, where you can see that this thing kind of isn't designed with the same care and consideration that we do with the arrival sequence of many buildings that, we talk about. I think many architects and designers, I think, really get excited about arrival sequence, and we really design that with great depth and care and consideration. And I think if we kind of applied that care and consideration to the access for all, I think, you could start to create some really interesting outcomes. So this is just to touch on, I think, just broadly the idea that I was picking up earlier in terms of that kind of separate approach. So you kind of have a red bubble, which is normative design, where we sort of consider the abled body. And that is the kind of core, sort of design approach when we imagine an end user. And I know this is something that Joss Boyce really picks up on, and it has been a real inspiration of mine. And this idea that we think about disability and the design for human difference as a very separate package. And it kind of comes often at a very late stage. And it's not thought of as part of the kind of whole sort of cohesive design. So this is a case study that I'm going to talk about briefly. That again, here we can start to see some of this theory applied that I've spoken about. So this is 1 Great George Street. It's the Institute of Civil Engineers. And recently, Sesame Access Solutions installed the invisible disabled access lift. So of course, here it's a good thing that I guess level access is provided into this building, but we can see here that historical preservation kind of really led the story here. And the idea that they've installed this kind of disappearing lift and clad the steps in exactly the same stone that you see on the left of the stairs, the original stairs that don't move. So the person in the wheelchair would roll up, press the button, and the stairs retreat, and the platform lift sort of delivers them up the stairs and into the building. And I think you can start to see how, yes, I think from a kind of social and medical model point of view, this is a functional solution and it delivers people from A to B. But from an affirmative model point of view, we can start to argue that actually, the experiential reality of the stairs kind of disappearing and being invisible, I think sends quite a powerful message. So this is a case study that's written about by Jay Dolmage, and in one of Joss Boyce's books that I'll touch on, which I think is also really interesting. Again, picking up on the kind of the balance between experiential and functional. So this is the Brunel Lecture Centre, and Jay Dolmage just kind of really highlights that these stairs, the kind of wave of plateaus of this courtyard, they kind of function as a kind of social, they have a social function as well as a functional, a kind of a circulation function in student life. I think lots of people use these steps as a way to kind of hang out, and they kind of spill out onto the grassy patch below. And the solution here was just to provide level access. You can kind of see that ephemeral steel ramp in the bottom right corner of the image, which is delivering students down into this kind of like awkward pinch between the tree and the base of the steps. And again, there's another ramp just on the left, which kind of, again, connects that third plateau. Which again, from the medical and social model point of view, this is a functional kind of solution. It gets people from A to B. But what it doesn't do, I think, if you were to look at it from the kind of more affirmative point of view, Jay Dolmage highlights that actually it's really missing, I think, that kind of social aspect. Students aren't able to kind of get stuck into that social aspect. Jay argues that also the ephemeral kind of steel nature of the ramp is in kind of stark difference to the kind of more brutal concrete. And he argues that maybe it should be stitched in and share the same materiality and be given the same care and consideration that the main building has. And I think while I agree that I think the same care and consideration should be given, I think personally the affirmation model would argue that we shouldn't kind of stitch things in apologetically. I think it would be a real missed opportunity. And I think one thing, again, aligning with that, focusing on the reality, I think it would allow us to kind of confront the reality of the discriminatory sort of history and the reality of that, and design it in kind of stark difference to the building itself. And I think that would send a powerful signal in the same way, but in a different tone, I think, to the previous case study. And then finally, this is another case study that Joss Boyce kind of collects in a book. And this is Chambers Macmillan Architects. It's called Ramp House. And this isn't necessarily around retrofit, but I think this is a really interesting topic. This is a new build. And while it kind of seems quite simple, I think the message here in the design process is really powerful. The idea that one member of the family uses a wheelchair, and rather than kind of installing a stair lift and then having stairs and separating that circulation, they decided to really take the ramp and stitch it as the kind of the core idea of the house. And not only does it kind of just provide circulation, it kind of actually has a kind of social function for the family, and it spills off into these plateaus. And I think one really important point is that you can kind of see that child on the bottom right side, which is kind of flying down the ramp on a little kind of scooter. And the idea here is, these things, it's not just in need of or responding to the need of a wheelchair user, it can also be enjoyed by many different people. And I think just starting to think about it in that way as a kind of cohesive whole, and how this space can be enjoyed by different bodies and different ways of movement, I think is really important. And I'll just end on this quote, which I think was really powerful. Disability is a reality, but disability is also produced sometimes most powerfully through our design of space. Thank you very much.
So my name is Pip Jackson, and I'm Head of Inclusive Environments at University College London. And I have to say to you, it's never a position society or I ever thought that I would ever hold. And I'm also president of the Access Association, which is an association of all people that are hugely interested in the inclusiveness of our built environments. We've got people that do inclusive environments as part of their day job, like myself, and then people that have got it as a part of their job or are really passionate about that subject matter and do it and want to learn more and gain more knowledge. And the reason why I say I'm as shocked as anybody that I've ended up here today is because I have been registered blind since the age of 13. And I got kicked out of my careers development classes at school because I would not believe that I could not do A-levels. And I would not believe that I could not go to university. So the head of careers wrote me off as absolutely uncontrollable and kicked me out. That was it. He washed his hands of me. And if I wouldn't accept that I was not going to become a piano tuner, I'm completely tone deaf. You'll be glad I'm not singing tonight. Then it was never going to be a reality. But I had a dream and I had a passion. And I had a passion because my grandma found me this cutting in a newspaper of two visually impaired people who had made their first million and were directors of their own company. And I carried that piece of paper in my purse for years, and I was utterly distraught when on a very drunk night at university I lost that purse, because it wasn't the purse or the money I cared about. It was that very dogged scrap of newspaper that was holding my passion and my belief that I could go somewhere up. That was my proof that I wasn't as delusional as some people, like the careers advisor, thought I might be. So I went to university. And I did a BA, and I decided that I had to do something for my dissertation. I was doing politics with French. So I decided the Disability Discrimination Act was coming out. And I thought, maybe I better know what my rights are going to be if the world of work is going to be anywhere near as much as the world of education was. So that's what I studied. And I went to work at the Department for Education, working in their special educational needs departments, which was quite ironic because I was the only disabled person working in the department at the time. So I was the only person who had any user experience of what it was like to go through school as a disabled individual. And I left there and moved to the City of London Corporation. And I moved for solely geographical reasons. They were moving to Darlington. I had no desire at all to move to Darlington. Nothing against Darlington at all. So I moved to the City of London Corporation, and that's where I met Andrew, who was the founder of the environmental access course here at the City of London. I met him after I met one of his first cohort of students, Julie Fleck, who led that team. And it was the two of them that had that belief, like that scrap of paper, that I, as a visually impaired person, could go somewhere and that I could bring my user experience into the world of building design and work with them to make buildings more inclusive for people. So I have a huge debt of gratitude to both of them. And Andrew and I had many conversations about this subject and about the expectations on people and how we designed places and spaces so that things didn't appear like an add-on, so they felt part of the natural experience. And there were several projects we led at the City of London Corporation. And one of the ones that I still to this day am hugely proud of is the access into the Great Hall, which used to be stepped. But eventually we managed to persuade the heritage people that we could ramp it, and we could ramp it in a way that was inclusive but didn't lose the aesthetic of the environment and the crypt area that we were in. And that's my day. Like, it still really was one of the few times where, you know, you're really proud of what you did. And afterwards, nobody can remember what it looked like before. There's a few people who can probably remember that drunk, they didn't fall down the steps anymore after the events there. But other than that, it doesn't look like we've made any changes. And he taught me that. He taught me that you could push the boundaries and you could achieve things. And it, you know, has been the basis of my life ever since. And the City of London Access Group is also another huge player in the work that I did at the City of London, which is where I really had my first foray into that environment of built environment being accessible and inclusive. And the City of London Access Group was a set of individuals who lived, worked, or had a strong affiliation with the City of London, who came in, and every single time we had major planning applications, they would come in and they would critique the plans that were put in front before they got anywhere near the planning committee. And they would challenge the architects. And it was always amazing to me that architects who had been cocky as hell at planning committee were now quivering wrecks in the corridor outside with me because they were being launched to talk to this bunch of disabled people, and it petrified them. I mean, who they thought they were getting, I don't know. But what they would get never met their expectations. Most would think they were going to meet a nice bunch of disabled people over a tea and a coffee and maybe a custard cream. And these disabled people were going to be utterly grateful that you'd spared them 5 minutes and were listening to what they had. What they got was a bunch of feisty individuals who understood the building regulations better than most of the people presenting, who knew exactly what they wanted and would ask the difficult questions. And it was amazing to see how the plans could suddenly change when they were having to explain to a gentleman in a wheelchair why they weren't putting in an evacuation lift because they'd got him into the building. Why was he worried about getting back out again in the event of an emergency situation? And when he said, so you're telling me my life is less valuable than yours, that's why you're not bothering, it was really interesting to see how plans could suddenly be changed and how with co-design and working with disabled people, you could end up with a much, much better scheme. And we continued that work when I moved to the GLA on a secondment as their principal access lead. And that was another opportunity to bring people in to have co-design. I'm one disabled person, me and my slightly grubby white cane that probably isn't white anymore, have one experience of disability, one experience of visual impairment. But by bringing groups together, there's a real opportunity to have those challenges, have those conversations and to reach those compromises. I, as a visually impaired person, want a semi-decent light level. I don't want it too bright. I absolutely don't want it dark. I've got no night vision at all. But I work with colleagues who equally have got a visual impairment who would like the light levels really, really low. So obviously, you're not going to have the two of us sat in a space and we're both going to be happy. Things do have to be a compromise. And that work still continues today. The London Legacy Development Corporation, they too, through Julie Fleck and her learnings from Andrew, they really embedded inclusion into the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and the celebrations that we saw in 2012. So they went in with the design of, we're not just going to do the basics, we're going to go beyond. And so there was a remit right from the outset that in the park, they weren't going to have ramps. They were going to aim, despite the topography, to try whatever possible to have nothing steeper than 1 in 60. So it wasn't just you could get everywhere step-free. It was you could get everywhere step-free without having to have the most enormous muscles to power yourself up these very steep inclines. And those sorts of things are really important because, as Christopher says, the difference between, what you can achieve and what the regulations ask you to achieve is very different to what makes for a comfortable, pleasant experience. And that work continues today in what I'm doing at the University College London. I was brought in under the remit originally. They had gone for the British Disability Foundation's accreditation to say that they were an inclusive, accessibly designed environment and that they were thinking about disabled people. And when I took on that role very clearly at interview They still employed me anyway, more for them. And I really said to them, I'm not going to just get you a nice emblem you can put on your website, pat yourself on the back and say, yeah, yes. That's not what I do. Also, what I don't do is accept that disabled people are just disabled people. I'm a disabled person. I'm a female. I'm also a mother of 3 children. And I'm a mother of 3 children, some of whom have disabilities themselves. So I don't fit in one neat, nice box of disability. I reach across into other areas of life. And just like any other parent, I can be embarrassing, always a win. I can do parenting well, I can do parenting badly. But I'm a parent nonetheless. And I want to go out with my children. It's half term next week. I'm off to go bore them. Apparently, we're not looking at how accessible the Elizabeth line is. Apparently, I do have to do that trip on my own. But, I can always try to persuade them to join me. And so we're looking at UCL about how we don't just meet the bare minimum standards. We don't just design our buildings to meet approved document M. We don't just design our buildings to meet the British standards. We go beyond that and we recognise that people fit in various groups, but also other areas. So beyond even the protected characteristics, how do we design our buildings, our workspaces, our study spaces and our event spaces so that they are inclusive of everybody, including anybody going through the menopause, anybody on IVF treatment, which aren't traditionally thought about when we think about an inclusive environment, but they're important nonetheless. Because if we want to have as a university, a really good teaching output, a really good research output, we need a diversity in our student and staff populations. And that comes from the buildings we design. Whether or not, when you walk in the door as an individual, you feel welcome and you feel that your needs are met, and they're met in a way that isn't really like, would you like a cup of tea and a biscuit, dear? But in a way that just means that you are the same as everybody else in your experience of that space. That, for me, is what an inclusive environment is. You don't see it and you won't see it, but everybody feels it within inside them. And that is so important. And that comes from what Andrew was always about. And like him, or break the boundaries. He, as a wheelchair user, was always breaking the boundaries. He had a fabulous house he retired to in Deal on the Kent coast. And it wasn't a bungalow like everybody thought a wheelchair user should live in. It was a 4-story shop conversion. And my daughter, my eldest daughter, to this day can still remember the fun of going to Andrew's house and playing hide and seek, because they'd jump in his lift and I had to go find them somewhere, and I was running up and down the stairs of this 4-story house. But that to her was the biggest fun. But for Andrew, what it gave him was the ability to have a rooftop area where he for once could be looking down on all those people scurrying up and down the high street, rather than his usual vista as a wheelchair user up people's noses, really wishing they'd invest in a nose hair trimmer. That is what inclusive design is not pushing people into the boxes that we think they should belong on, but allowing them the freedom of choice to do what they want to do. Thank you.
I really would like to start by just thanking both of you for really incredibly articulate, but also really powerful presentations that I think just spanned so much. I was trying to take notes as you were speaking and I couldn't write fast enough. But I guess, Chris, when you framed it as through the lens of the retrofit, it was really interesting, because I think especially challenging this idea that so often to make inclusive space, it's considered a bolt on, but actually with all the existing buildings that are out there right now, how can we like meaningfully design space that everyone feels comfortable in? And I think, Pip, as you were saying, that there's so much nuance to like what makes one person feel comfortable isn't the same as what makes another one. And how do you find that compromise? How do you actually involve people using space in what they might want their space to be, rather than assuming that we always know that? So I think to open up the discussion, which we hope everyone's prepared to participate in, the kind of bigger question that we were hoping to discuss today is really how we can not just define, and it was really nice that you had the affirmative definitions to change how we discuss, I guess, disability and impairment, but how do we also expand our understanding of movement through places of domesticity, like this one that's now become a space of education, but also spaces of practice, and then just out there in the city. And I mean, it's a big question, but I think maybe to start, it would be great to hear from both of your experiences, what are ways in which we could be teaching this better in architecture schools? And yeah, then maybe we go from there.
Sure. Yeah. I think personally, my personal experience of it in an education setting, I think, I grew up with the attitude, and I think this is why I really sort of in my work focus a lot on these kind of like attitudes and perspectives, because when I grew up, it was really framed disability was a bad thing. So, yes, okay, I was physically impaired, but I think disability was something that I could it was seen as something that I could strive to not be. Because obviously it's seen very negatively, and we think about disabled people with kind of tragedy and pity and those kind of things. So I think, especially it took a really long time for me to kind of start to understand that, the affirmation model for me was really powerful because it allowed me kind of choice. I think, it wasn't something that was applied to me. So I think kind of taking ownership in that and saying, okay, I'm part of the disabled community. I think that was a really powerful first step. And I think in terms of an education setting, I hadn't really been encouraged to look at that before, because I think it's something that we really focus on, or we treat with kind of awkwardness, I think, because of that air of kind of negativity around the subject. So I think, it was this hesitation that maybe I'd be offended if somebody sort of said to me, this is something that maybe you might want to talk about. You can talk about this creatively. It can be a source of creativity and a source of inspiration that you can kind of apply to the world. And it's obviously something that comes from a personal experience, and it's something I can get really passionate about. So I think that, again, it's a kind of, it was an attitude kind of, and a kind of, how to describe it? It was a framework, a kind of theoretical framework, I think, that somebody kind of allowed me to apply to my work that I'd never done before. So yeah, I think that's kind of my comment on education specifically, I think.
I mean, I think for me, it's about making sure that we do hold those discussions, and that we do kind of have architects that are coming out into the world that aren't going to be quivering in a corridor because they've been asked to talk to a bunch of disabled people, that they, can go in and have the same conversations as they would when they're at planning committee, that they've got the confidence and the skill set to do that. Now, that comes partly from the diversity, and Joss has got a fabulous programme Beyond Sight at UCL that brings in visually impaired people into that world of architecture and shows them that they can become an architect. And I wish I was that age of being an undergrad now, without mortgaged children and everything that I have now. I'd go back and do that again, to be in the driving seat of change. And we need to see, and through programmes like that, we need to see more disabled people in the world of architecture, having those conversations and being open. And we need to not be frightened. For me, I mean, we had this discussion at the School of Architecture just a few weeks ago. We need to be able to have those conversations and not be so scared of saying the wrong thing that we just don't have them. That's not really the solution to things. We need to have them, and we need to empower those that are going into this world to have those conversations and think about it. And Julie Fleck, who I worked with at the City of London, who, as I said, was part of Andrew's very first programme here at the Architectural Association, she would always say to you, you need to bring in people and to have those conversations and to be part of the co-design with you. You can't just employ one inclusion specialist like myself. I mean, much as, there's a lot of people who work in my field who'll shoot me for saying that, but you need to bring in those people with the disabled population to have those conversations together. But we also need to stop segregating people. So instead of having one conversation with disabled people and another conversation with cyclists, we need to bring those groups together so that they can start to understand each other's needs. So we did a piece of work at UCL to look at our new sports centre that we're looking at having. And it's a sports centre for our staff and students. And there are regs out there to tell us how to make it inclusive of disabled people, how to make it inclusive for ambulant disabled people, wheelchair using disabled people. But we went beyond that and we had real engagement with the student union, and we brought together the leads for the faith groups. We brought together the representations from the BAME community. We brought together disabled people. We brought together the trans community, the LGBT community. We brought together those people that ultimately could be running the sports centre if the student union take on running it. And we had a really open discussion about the fact that we wanted to design this space so that everybody felt comfortable in it. So we had to do a lot of education there within the groups. So the LGBT trans community initially just wanted everything to be gender neutral. But once we started having conversations about the needs of certain faith groups, the needs of individuals who've maybe experienced sexual abuse in their lives, the conversation changed. And what we've ended up with is a design that hopefully will mean that everybody can partake in sports, whatever your age, your gender, your disability, your faith, the colour of your skin, regardless. We're trying to work together with a design that will make everybody feel happy. But it's important that you bring everybody in on those conversations together for me.
I wonder if I could add points. I actually think I couldn't agree more. And I think the idea of kind of getting it wrong, I think is really important in this space. And I think that kind of building that fallibility into it in terms of a kind of messy design process. You made a really good point of the kind of contradictory nature of many people's needs. And I think, you're never going to find a one size fits all solution. And I think that goes for kind of thinking about human difference, but that goes with many other aspects too. And I think in a really interesting point, we think about that kind of fallibility in terms of just like a cultural sense between sort of people. But I think also it's interesting to talk about in a kind of RIBA stages sense that, that's kind of built into the kind of system there for us to kind of deliver a project and then stop. And it's not really built into the system, I think, to be able to kind of review that project and potentially see those kind of contradictory natures and then readdress them. And that's where I think that retrofit comes in, where things are kind of retrofitted as a kind of bolt-on functional thing. And it just a kind of add-on. It's something that you could probably just find on a catalogue and you just throw it in and it fixes the solution. And I think, the idea of trying to get that as part of the kind of creative process, I think, and get the minds that apply that creativity to, your material decisions or where you put the door or those kind of things that we talk about with sort of huge care and consideration. I think kind of applying that in the same way to this topic, I think would be incredible. And, the outcomes would be pretty groundbreaking, I think.
And I don't think we're going to get it right. By no means do I think that this new sports facility is going to be the way we do it. But the important thing is we'll do it and then we'll go back and learn the lessons. So how many times do we do a project, we finish it, and then we're on to the next project? What's really important is to go back and do that learning piece and review and admit that none of us is perfect at all. I'm not perfect, definitely not perfect. My children will tell you that any day of the week. But we have to, there's nothing wrong with admitting that we didn't get it right. What is wrong is if we fail to learn from it. And that's the important piece. To think that, you've got that qualification, you're off into the world, that is not the end of your education. I'm in my mid-40s now. There's still things I learn every day. And that piece of work with all those groups together was a real learning piece to make sure that we thought about everybody together. So I think that's another important thing, to never think you know everything.
Chris, I'm really interested in your work with retrofit, because I think that is like part of a wider conversation that in general, we need to stop building so many buildings and try and retrofit them. And it also made me think about a story I've heard about the AA, that it used to have a ramp outside, I think, in the 90s, but the Blooms, because it is a historic listed building, it kind of falls under all those restrictions that you spoke about. And I think it was maybe the Bloomsbury group who sort of got in touch to say you have to take that away because it violates the historic regulations. And I think that's something that will be interesting maybe in this charrette that we hope to do, is kind of think about how we can kind of retrofit the AA itself and how these conversations can help influence that. But I was wondering if you have any examples of retrofit that you think have been done well and sort of caringly. I think the examples you showed were slightly sort of creepy.
Not quite. And I think that's the thing. I think we're always kind of in this framework, especially of sort of stitching things in, or potentially actually the governance around it is really restrictive. One interesting point, I think, around that one Great George Street that I didn't actually mention in the presentation is that, the reason they took that approach is because of the constraints on the building was so tight. It was, the boundary line of the plot meant that they couldn't install a ramp. I'm sure there was a feasibility study where they looked at that and said, it's not feasible for us to install a ramp here because we'd have to use kind of public land. And, that's a constraint, but it's not a physical constraint. That's a kind of a socially constructed constraint that we've applied on this project. And I think that goes back to that kind of Equality Act thing where I said it's this reasonable adjustments. There it was deemed unreasonable to kind of provide that because it would interrupt the interrupt the public realm, or maybe if they were to kind of then start to chip away at the building, then you have a kind of historical preservation issue. And I think there's just so many of these things that are kind of built in that make this just an absolute minefield. And I think Joss Boyce talks about it sort of really amazingly and picks up on the kind of real reliance and the burden of regulation and guidance and these kind of things that I think, if you applied that level of kind of regulation and standards and things on anything, it would just really kind of take the pinch out of creativity. It would be so hard to kind of apply that level of creativity that you do with other aspects of projects to like that kind of component.
It's also maybe really strange that we're tied to this kind of very historic aesthetic that doesn't necessarily reflect anyone who's using the building now. And I think it goes back to what you were both saying about like, why do we just finish projects and then move on to the next? And as now post-occupancy evaluation and things like that are becoming more prevalent, like, shouldn't this be built in there? And then maybe to put a similar question to you, Pip, I guess having worked at places like the GLA and LLDC and places like that, like, is it a question of policy, like really thinking how to move beyond this idea of what's reasonable and actually thinking more about like anyone can design, like hopefully if we're all designers, we should be able to design aesthetically pleasing kind of elements and strategies that can intervene with historic buildings. But the fact that like we're often constrained by these very old-fashioned rules that care about like the proportions of things staying the same rather than, I guess, trying to update them. And then often it's invisibilizing or making the experience subpar. I mean, in most historic buildings, the disabled access route is around the back and you never get the same experience. And so I was just wondering, like, from a policy level, what are ways to address this? Or are there conversations that are happening already that could give us some hope that there might be some change?
I mean, I think we have made progress. I mean, when I first started, there is no way English Heritage would ever have agreed to put a lift into the World Heritage Site that is St Paul's Cathedral. But I had a fabulous, and equally to put a ramp on the side, and I had a fabulously wet day. I mean, I know, mad to enjoy standing in the rain for 4 hours. But I did have a fabulously wet day standing in the rain at St Paul's Cathedral, looking at whether or not this ramp we'd designed to fit in with the original aesthetic of Christopher Wren was actually going to work. It was because the first time it was built basically in scaffold and dressed to look how it would eventually look, because we had to get it past all the bodies. But we had to do that, and that's wrong, but we had to do it, and we proved it, and it showed that you can do it. You can put on these things to something like St Paul's Cathedral, which isn't grade 2 or grade 2 site. It's a World Heritage Site, but it's been done in a way. And I think we do need to move beyond that kind of belief that things have to stay the same. But I think we are very, very stuck there. We haven't moved on, and I would say we're probably going back a bit in it. And again, it's too much of a local issue. So, you know, I've worked with several conservation officers over my career, and what one would agree to, another one won't. So you're far too much in the lap of somebody's personal viewpoint, and that is a real issue, and there's nowhere to go. So UCL has got this as a massive problem. 2/3 of our estate is listed, so all the time we're coming up with this battle, but we have got one conservation officer to go with, and her decision is final. But there's nowhere for us to go to challenge that, really, to easily challenge that, to say, but that's not reasonable. And you know, how can we change your mind, and how can we? And the same will be with the sustainability arguments. My sustainability colleagues are having exactly the same issues. We've got a lot of older buildings exactly like this, and they don't want us to fit double glazing, so they're cold and they're awful in winter, and the acoustics in them are dreadful, because originally they had a horse and cart going past them when they were built, and now we've allowed cars to go past them. But we haven't made that same journey with our buildings, which is a real struggle. And I'm not seeing a huge amount of light at the end of the tunnel, but I'll be quite happy to work with anybody that wants to help in that battle.
Exactly. That's hopefully the point of these conversations, that everyone can kind of collaborate and change things. I also just want to see if anyone in the room wanted to contribute or ask a question. Excellent.
Hi, thank you for the really wonderful talk. Kind of in the first place, I think my question was, so I feel like obviously this building point is kind of very pertinent, but I feel like it goes beyond that. Because the practice I work for, we kind of exclusively really do retrofit projects. We don't build, we kind of do retrofit. And I think, you know, is it up to architects at this point to kind of lobby to improve regulation in the first place? Because I think we often find that clients will kind of VE a lot of the kind of, you know, accessibility that's been designed into the project, because it's something that, you know, if it goes beyond, you know, the building regulation standard, they're like, oh, well, we don't need it then. And so I think it's often one of the first things to go. And no matter kind of, I feel like how much we push against it, I feel like it can only go so far until like regulation obviously stipulates it. And so I think I'm just interested in what your opinion is, and kind of whether as architects we need to kind of collectively use our power to improve the standards that are kind of found in regulation.
Yeah, I think great question. I think for me, I think I really see the power in this kind of cultural pressure. And I think that's why I think, you know, the affirmation model is so powerful for me. I think you're right. I think, you know, the kind of that financial viability question of taking lifts out and, you know, these kind of topics. I mean, yeah, okay, that's always going to be a kind of client decision. And I think, you know, we see what's kind of happened in the kind of the world of sustainability. You know, I think now more and more projects are doing it where maybe it's not, you know, a policy requirement, but they understand that to kind of be culturally relevant or to kind of have that public support, you know, that is something that kind of clients buy into, where it might not have a kind of direct financial return. So I think for me, I think, yes, I think, you know, look, policy change. I showed some examples where if that could change, that would be fantastic. But I think for me, changing that kind of cultural narrative of inclusion and kind of making it something that, everybody really sees as super important. And I think that for me is something that if we can work towards, because I think changing policy just to me seems really scary, and I don't know if it's possible. But I think, the kind of more cultural changes feels more like we can kind of rally together and do that. You're not beholden to politicians and their decisions and things like that. It's about kind of generating that force, I think, is something that I'm really excited about.
And I think also helping the client see to not have a vision of their building that's very, if I make this lift an evacuation lift, it's going to have extra cost. It may have an extra cost when you do the work, but the life cycle saving is an entirely different picture. And that's what's quite often missing when the value engineering piece is done, is that there's a huge cost saving there. You're not training people to do evac chairs. You're not, sending people out of the office on half-day training every 6 months, the maintenance cost of the evac chair, all those kind of things. And also the kind of whole thing about, any employer, the more diverse your population, the better it is for business. The evidence is there. There's nothing you can argue about with that. So I think it's every single one of us. It doesn't fall solely on one person. It relies on us as a community to ask those questions. When we're, if we're in a position where we're involved in design awards or running design competitions, why are we not running design competitions to? So we had one at the City of London that was to design the next city furniture for out in the public realm. But at no point until myself and Julie got involved, as we often do, did they start to think about the design of that furniture to meet everybody's needs, to make sure that everybody could feel comfortable to sit on it. So there are things there where we can, really push it. With the design competitions, have we awarded an award to a building which looks beautiful, but lets nobody in? And those are the questions and the challenges that we can ask and push for, I think.
Hi, thank you for the talk and for sharing your experience. It's been lovely. I think maybe I'm going to be a slightly red herring and rogue, but it's around the topic of heritage and retrofitting. And I think I'm just questioning the word heritage and what that means. And is heritage really heritage if it's exclusionary and reflects an exclusionary history? And is that something that should be celebrated, or something that we should say, well, that was the past and we're now adding an additional layer? And I think when you were talking about these kind of invisible elements that provide that access, I think almost now that they should almost crash and collide and disrupt and be these things that shake up the kind of the normality, to use the wrong word, but to shake up and disrupt the status quo, because I think now we're almost on that next epoch, the next kind of generation. How are we building on the past and saying that this was something that we have learned from? I don't know whether that was a question or just talking.
I agree. I think, these buildings were built in a time where, people with physical disabilities or any kind of disability was literally ostracized from society. So I think, and I think we're not just talking about disability here. I think you're right. I think, we're holding a kind of, an idea. These places were built when there were many ideas, and I think they capture many of those ideas. And I think preserving those is actually quite offensive. Yeah.
Definitely, I would certainly agree. And I don't think we've learned our lessons either. I think we're still designing buildings even now that, I could argue are accessible, but they're not inclusive, because we're asking different people to take different routes and to have different experiences. So I don't think we've learned anything at all, really, in a lot of respects. And I would love to see lots of various buildings torn down and major changes, because I think we do need to not get stuck in a moment of time. and we need to recognise, the mistakes of the past and learn from them. And this, we are not there now. I'm under no illusions. I would not be here today talking to you if I'd have been born 100 years ago. I'd have been hidden away and a disgrace to my family. But I'm here now, and I'm probably still a disgrace to my family, but nothing to do with my disability. But we're here, and the time has moved on, and we need to make sure that our buildings move with us. As I say, our roads have moved. We moved from horse and cart to cars. We haven't made that same transition with our buildings, and that is a real barrier to everybody in society, that fuller inclusion piece.
Hey, thanks very much for sharing everything. It's really interesting, some of the parallels you've made with sustainability. One of my favorite designers says, if you're going to be sustainable, just don't tell the client and just do it anyway. So avoiding waiting for regulations to catch up, do you think that then like architecture education needs to improve and needs to explore like the idea of people and their bodies and what do people need better as part intrinsically in education? And are there other creative industries which do this currently any better?
The tech industry does it so much better. So much better. There are so many things that we use every day commonly that came because the tech industry created something to make lives better for a set of disabled people that now everybody uses. And I think the tech industry, there are massive learnings that we can have from them. I own a set of Good Grips potato peelers. I'm sure there's many of us around the table that do, because they were designed to help a certain group of people with dexterity issues, but actually they're just much nicer to hold and much nicer to use. And so I think there's a lot, we could learn. And I think it is a dual thing. The regulations could change tomorrow, and there's individuals like myself asking people to, do certain things with our building, both our new and our old. But do they necessarily have the skill set to do that? Not always. And how many times am I having to do my own education piece just to end up with the building I want? And my time shouldn't be there, and it doesn't need to be there. So I think we shouldn't wait for regulation and policy to change and then play catch up. We need to ensure that those who've got any command of our built environment have got that skill set, and then hope that one day policy may catch up.
I think in education, the model of kind of you as an individual kind of approaching a brief and kind of imagining a space and designing it and drawing it up is kind of inherently kind of problematic, I think, from that perspective. Because I think, there was one key phrase that I think as part of disability activism, it was designed with us, not for us. And I think, kind of inviting that into a kind of education sphere, I think could be really exciting. I think, you spoke before about how in that kind of public consultation, they were kind of scared to talk to these people about it because, it was this awkward topic that they didn't know the language and this kind of thing. And I think that's a skill, and you need to kind of learn that. And I think, the ability to be able to talk to somebody in a way that allows you to kind of talk through their experience and allow them to, you to learn from them and them to learn from you, and that kind of that exchange, I think, education could really benefit from that. I think kind of inviting people in, doesn't necessarily have to just be people with disabilities, but I just think inviting that and into that sphere where maybe, you don't have a client and you don't have money involved. And it's, and I think that's what's really amazing about architectural education. I think some of these ideas that we're talking about in terms of like, tearing things down and doing things in this kind of attitude, I think, doing that in an education sphere, I think really kind of frees you up. I think that's a real opportunity to kind of free up from some of these constraints and just see what it could look like. And I think in the same way, I think, education could really help, I think, in just trying to use that as a bit of a test bed, I think, to understand like how that kind of co-design can work, where you're not trying to have to sort of use that time in resourcing sort of terminology and sell it to the client, or whether you don't sell it to the client, but then you have to make it work in a business term internally, like that kind of attitude. So I think, I think trying to just see the opportunities in that framework, I think could be really exciting.
Oh, hi. I'm not a designer, not an architect. I'm a commercial person. I've worked in investment banking spaces, et cetera, and I've not ever come across a firm that has cared. Your presentation about how people view disability triggers food for thought. My question, though, is if you do not standardize how you build, then, and it takes away creativity, then how do you trigger people to think the right way about disability when they care about the bottom line or they care about other things as opposed to people? Thanks.
I think, that whole, I hate using the economic argument, but it is there. I went to a new restaurant and the menus weren't in large print. It was really, really dark. I fell down the steps with no nosings. I'm not going back. Neither is my mother, who's registered blind. But neither is my brother, who has no disability whatsoever, because he's not going to a restaurant that doesn't make his mum and his sister feel welcome. And as I say, that whole thing about the research is there that says if you are a business, if you're a commercial venture and you don't have a diverse workforce, you are hitting your bottom line. So you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're doing yourself absolutely no favours, and you will get left behind. That's just the way it is. There's a reason people like Apple are doing so well in the tech industry, and that's because they've really started to look at this. Microsoft, the same. They've got whole groups, whole teams, whole investment in how to make their products more accessible. And as a result, they are the global leaders and they have got all that industry. So it's foolish to think that it's just a nice to do anymore. It's not a nice to do. It's important. And the next generations coming up are getting more and more vocal about it. We've seen that with our education program at UCL on sustainability. We've got a massive number of students who choose to come to UCL because of our sustainable education program. And the next generation care so much about the planet that we live in and how we leave it, and they're going to make more demands than anybody else, and rightly so. Expectations are changing. When I went through school, it was quite an oddity for a disabled student to be allowed to stay in a mainstream school. We're now, all these years later, my children with their disabilities, there was not even a question about sending them to a special school. We've made that leap and jump, and we will continue, I hope, to make those leaps and jumps, hopefully much faster. Hopefully we start to create a snowball effect and it'll all get faster and faster and faster, and we'll reach my utopia before I leave this planet. But we're always moving. The goalposts are moving, and we can't rest where we are. And any company or organisation that thinks they can is going to get left behind, unfortunately.
I think it's the kind of also the idea of standardization, and I think maybe even under the banner of this, this series of talks, New Standard, I think that's kind of why I made that point, or tried to make that point at the start of this presentation. When I kind of approached this topic, I definitely was kind of looking for, as I was seeing a set of standards or a set of practices that I kind of knew weren't kind of up to scratch. And then, I was coming to the presentations and reading the books, just trying to find the alternative way of doing it. But I think as soon as you kind of delve into this subject, the contradictory nature of it, I think inherently just means that, you're never going to find a replacement standard. You're asking for essentially like a universal design. And I think in a sense, I know that's kind of really difficult, especially from maybe like an investment banking point of view. But I think, where essentially like a lot of things have to be quantified. And I think, the regulations at the moment are trying to quantify things. And that's not to say that I don't think the standards aren't useful. I think, like ramp ratios are useful and the graphic design standards are useful. But I think if you rely on them kind of for your output, I think you're just going to get the same thing every single time. So I think, you know, trying to balance those two approaches where, you know, yes, you can be informed by a series of standards, which I'm sure are based on really sort of important research, but just kind of allowing that space to kind of apply a little bit of creativity and think about things experientially, which are never going to be standardized, because, you know, you have to approach every kind of task with a kind of bespoke approach, like we do when we approach any kind of site. I think, you know, architects, designers, whatever it may be, I think, you know, you like to approach each site with a kind of bespoke approach, thinking about its context and thinking about maybe even its history and all those kind of things. And you try to find narratives and stories. And I think just applying that same mindset, I think, to this topic, I think, you know, I think that's kind of what I was talking about, or what I tried to talk about is this kind of like attitudinal shift for designers, I think, is kind of what I'm trying to encourage.
And standards don't have to stifle creativity. So if you look at the Laban Dance Centre in Greenwich, they've got a handrail that goes all the way down their ramp, and it waves in its height all the way down in a beautiful curve up and down, and it bounces between the top and the bottom heights that are set in the standards. But it doesn't look just like a handrail down a ramp. It looks aesthetically beautiful as it dances its way down this ramp, but it still performs the same functionality that everybody else does in a very straight, very boring handrail. So the two don't have to go together. They don't necessarily contradict one another. You can do the two in tandem with one another. And that's what we need to challenge ourselves to do, is to not necessarily do the easy way of doing things and to think that, you know, one straight handrail is it. We need to challenge ourselves to think about how we, within the boundaries of regulation and standardization, create something that is still aesthetically pleasing and aesthetically beautiful. You know, I go back to those good grips handles. They're still aesthetically pleasing, but they're very, very functional. It clearly can be done, and we need to get our built environment to catch up with that mentality, really.
Hi. Thank you very much for very provocative and important discussion. My heart is pondering, so I don't know if I can articulate what I want to say well, but it's such a complex issues. Essentially, in my mind, is the relationship of the body and mind. And it's also, of course, about differences. I think the word disability, impairment, disadvantage, design solutions have given us some frame of mind to see things with a bit of colored lens, but we are all different. I'm very short. My tutor, I'm graduate from here a long time ago. I'm doing PhD here. My tutor used to tell me, Takako, you have to carry your folding chair so that you can lift yourself up to other people's point of view. So I am being short has a very different point of view of the world. And I can't see the dust on the shelf so that my mind is peaceful, you know. But anyway, that I think the difference is really about imagination and being able to imagine other people's experiences. It's all really about experiences and experiential relation to the world and how we carry ourselves with our own baggage. And I recently had an accident and fractured my right arm. So my relation to the world suddenly changed, and having to negotiate quite a lot. And so that my personal experience has taught me different body and different relationship. And also in relation to what other industrial area is very helpful is dance. is choreographic movement practice with always mind and the body. And I know I am from one of the groups that uses performance and being in the world, in the urban space, as relation to the body's experiences. And I know that the urban planning has started to work with choreographers who does dance is not really just about style at all. It's about mind. And I also teach with the idea of performance in architecture, which is, like you said, the children now have very lower barrier between differences in a way, because they are so exposed to many differences already, so that the education is about changing the mind, changing how we perceive or perception change, how we work together. And so in my opinion, in my view, it's important to come back to the relationship to the mind and the body in a very fundamental way, especially, for architectural education, who tend to forget the body recently. So that bring back the body, bring up the whole experiential learning by doing, not in, of course, making is all one, but moving is another way of learning. Sorry, I'm just wanted to share. But the technical solutions, regulations are products of probably often people who don't really know the reality of things, so that the dance can work, tech can work together, and the open mind work together with imagination. Sorry, it became long.
Didn't know if you wanted to respond to that, but there's a comment online that I can read out otherwise.
I guess just an interesting point, actually. I think, maybe something to comment is that, a lot of my presentation, I think it does focus on a kind of like a physical disability perspective. And I think it is quite important that you start to talk about, whether you decide to think about the mind and the body as two separate things or one thing. And I think, there's an interesting kind of topic there, which I kind of haven't really delved into. But I think personally, I feel really comfortable talking about it from quite a physical disability point of view. But I think as I started to get into this, I realized that, there are so many layers to this. And I think, I think that really requires unpacking as well.
Do you want to say anything, Pip?
I was just going to say, just last week, the British Standards Institute launched PAS, a specification that's all about design for the mind, and how we make our places and spaces feel for those whose disability is not as visible as say my disability is, and that is really important, and that it kind of shows the kind of progress that we are making. When I very first started out in this industry, it was much more about step-free access, and it was, there was hints of making places accessible for the deaf and blind community, but the journey we've been on is evolving, and it what I would have done 20 years ago is not what I would do now, and we have to keep pushing forward and wanting better for everybody, and biophilic design is by far coming into the fore to make sure that, regardless of disability or no disability, how people feel in a space and how their well-being and mental health is in that space is thought about. And we don't end up with these concrete jungles that have no nature to them to make us, connect with it in that way.
So there's a comment online that just wanted to add to what you were mentioning before about the tech industry. And it's from Sarah, who couldn't join us physically, so she's joining us on Zoom. And it says there was research done by Microsoft in 2003 that analyzed groups in terms of how disabling the technology was. And there's a really stark visualization of this that unfortunately they can't share because limitations of this technology, but it's a pyramid with only 21% of the participants who had no difficulty in using the piece of tech, whereas the rest of the 79% of the set felt mild, moderate to severe difficulty, which only suggests that disability is not a minority issue, but actually one of a majority. And they say that it's really about shifting the dialogue with this perspective, i.e. difference is normal. And so I think I think they just wanted to mention that this is actually a business case, because imagine not providing for 79% of the population, which I thought, given I'm just conscious of the time, and our interpreters have been working very hard for an hour and a half. So I thought that would be maybe a good point to maybe close this more formal part of the conversation, and encourage everyone, if you have time, to please stick around. Please continue to eat and drink and chat. I know you have a question, so please ask it. Don't go without asking it. But I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and a huge thanks to Chris and Pip for amazing presentation.